Imagine loving someone so unconditionally, so obsessively, that you are willing to break every ethical boundary. Willing to conduct chemical experiments just to make them feel the same way about you. But some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. And the consequences may be far greater than you ever imagined. The Neurochem Lab's laboratory was engulfed in absolute silence, broken only by the constant hum of computers and the occasional clinking of glass against metal. Ethan Carter had been there for hours, alone. His eyes fixed on the small blue vial in his hand. He had spent years studying the neurochemical processes of love. Dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin. What made a person fall in love? Why did some emotional bonds seem unbreakable while others faded without explanation? He wanted answers, but more than anything he wanted Laura Whitmore. Laura, with her loosely tied brown hair, her spontaneous smile, her passion for science. She was the only person who made Ethan feel less invisible. But she never looked at him the way he wished she would. Always kind, always attentive, but never interested. Never romantic. He had tried everything. More personal conversations, clumsy attempts at compliments, small gestures of affection. But Laura only saw him as a colleague, maybe even as a friend. He knew he should accept that, but he didn't. And that's how he crossed the line. In the lab, between trivial experiments and reports, he had been building his own secret research. Small doses of substances tested in isolated samples. Chemical combinations that could stimulate specific emotions. All of it hidden in notebooks no one else would ever see. The first formula failed. And the second. The third made a lab rat follow another around the enclosure. But there was no sign of anything real. It was just fixation, not love. Not enough. Then came the final version. The mixture was delicate, an exact balance between stimulation and emotional memory. It wasn't enough to create a chemical surge. The brain needed to fill in the gaps with meaning. That was what made love so powerful. It wasn't just a biological reaction, it was a story the mind told itself. Ethan held the small vial, feeling the cold glass between his fingers. The liquid inside looked harmless, almost ordinary. But he knew what he had just created. The formula of the heart. And after its creation, he couldn't stop thinking about Laura. The way she laughed. The way she furrowed her brow when concentrating. The sound of her voice, always full of energy. Maybe deep down she already felt something for him. Maybe all she needed was a little push. And now, holding that formula, he finally had that power. The next morning, Ethan watched her discreetly in the laboratory cafeteria, waiting for the right moment. Laura was distracted, scrolling through her phone while pouring coffee from the automatic machine. He approached naturally, holding his own cup, trying to ignore the guilt crawling through his mind. "Too early for that much coffee?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She laughed. That effortless, genuine laugh that made his chest tighten. It's never too early for caffeine. It was the perfect moment. With a quick, discreet motion, he poured a few drops of the formula of the heart into her coffee. She would never know. All she would feel was a growing desire, an uncontrollable attraction. For him. Laura took the first sip, and Ethan held his breath. He had to stay close while the formula took effect. But then, something happened. And that something had a name, Richard Blake. Their boss walked into the cafeteria at that exact moment, heading toward the coffee machine just as the formula began working inside Laura. Ethan felt his stomach twist when he noticed how she suddenly froze. Her body tensed, her eyes locked onto Richard as if she were seeing him for the first time. As if something inside her had been awakened. Richard, as usual, didn't notice anyone. He walked past her without the slightest acknowledgement, too focused on his own priorities. But Laura remained still, biting her lip, her eyes shining with an admiration that Ethan had never seen before. A wave of panic surged up his throat. No, this wasn't possible. He nearly knocked over a rack of test tubes in his shock. What was happening? The formula was supposed to bind her feelings to him, not someone else. Not to the worst possible person. Richard Blake was unbearable. Arrogant, cold, completely devoid of empathy. He was feared and respected, sure, but never admired for his humanity. He treated his employees like disposable cogs in a machine. And yet, Laura was looking at him as if he were the only thing that mattered in the world. A sharp, ice-cold dread sliced through Ethan's body. He had given the formula to Laura, and she had fallen for the wrong man. The effect of the formula was like an invisible fire consuming Laura from the inside. At first, it was just a lingering glance. Then, a subtle shift in posture, a different sparkle in her eyes. But as the hours passed, Ethan began to realize the full extent of the disaster he had caused. Laura wasn't just interested in Richard. She was completely obsessed. He saw it in the way she started getting closer to their boss, more than usual. Whenever Richard walked down the hallway, she would find an excuse to be nearby. Small questions about projects, comments about the weather, jokes that Richard never found funny but that Laura insisted on making. And the worst part was how she misinterpreted everything. That afternoon, while they were in the conference room, Richard did what he always did. He was harsh. He cut off a colleague mid-presentation, criticized the experiment results without a shred of concern, and then snapped at Laura because her reports were taking too long to be delivered. Ethan expected her to be irritated, maybe even humiliated. But she wasn't. Laura smiled. "Sorry, Richard, you're absolutely right," she said, a strange glow in her eyes. Ethan's own eyes widened. This couldn't be real. When the meeting ended, Laura turned to him, overflowing with enthusiasm. "Did you see how direct he is? No nonsense, no fake niceties. The way he talks, his serious tone, every word of his inspires me." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "He was rude, Laura. As always." She let out a soft, dreamy laugh. "Oh, come on, Ethan. He just demands the best from the team. It's inspiring. He pushes us to high performance, makes us improve every day, takes us out of our comfort zone. Every word he says makes me love life, the lab, everything even more." Ethan wanted to scream. In the days that followed, it only got worse. Laura started praising Richard to everyone around her. She said he was brilliant, strong, determined. If he ignored her, she thought it was charm. If he raised his voice, she interpreted it as leadership. Ethan watched the absurdity unfold before his eyes, and it was all his fault. One day, in the cafeteria, Richard was getting coffee when Laura eagerly approached him. "Do you want me to bring you some sugar?" she asked, cheerful. Richard didn't even look at her. "Take it black. But instead of offering me sugar, why don't you explain why your reports are late?" Laura blinked a few times, caught off guard by the sudden question, but quickly recovered. Her smile remained steady, as if she hadn't noticed the sharpness in his voice. "Oh, Well, I was reviewing some data before submitting." "Reviewing?" Richard interrupted, letting out an impatient sigh. "You just had to follow the protocol. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, Laura." She nodded quickly. "Of course. I just wanted to make sure everything was perfect before submitting it." Richard let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "And in the middle of all that, you thought offering me sugar was a priority." Ethan, sitting a few tables away, clenched his fists under the table. "He's going to stop, right?" But Richard didn't stop. Instead, his voice rose. "Listen, Laura, if you have time to walk around handing out sugar, maybe I should reassign your tasks to something more useful. Or do you need to review that as well?" Some people in the cafeteria glanced over, sensing the growing tension. "But Laura," she smiled, "you're right. I was careless, and I love that you're teaching me how to work." Ethan felt nausea rise in his throat. Richard scoffed and grabbed his coffee. "If the reports aren't on my desk by 5, don't bother showing up tomorrow." And with that, he walked away. Laura remained there, holding her cup as if nothing had happened. Ethan waited for her to at least look frustrated, to take a deep breath and gather herself. But she didn't. She turned back to the table and sighed, an admiring glow in her eyes. "He's incredible, isn't he? Ethan couldn't stop himself. "Laura, for God's sake." She looked at him, confused. "What?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you not realize what just happened? He humiliated you in front of everyone." Laura shook her head, laughing softly. "No, Ethan," he corrected me. "He demands excellence. That's what a leader does." Ethan felt his stomach drop. It didn't matter how cruel Richard was. It didn't matter how obvious the humiliation was. Laura remained blind. And it was all because of him. The lab was cloaked in dim light when Ethan finally made the decision he had been avoiding. There were no more excuses, no more attempts to fix things in secret. He had to tell Laura the truth. It wasn't just the crushing guilt that kept him awake at night. It wasn't just the anguish of watching her devote all her admiration to a man who didn't care about her. It was because, no matter how painful it was to admit, Laura deserved to know. She had been manipulated, and the only person who could set her free was him. The next morning, Ethan found her in the lab, completely distracted, scribbling notes in a notebook while smiling to herself. He didn't need to ask who she was thinking about. He already knew. He took a deep breath, feeling the words tighten in his throat. "Laura, can I talk to you?" She lifted her gaze, blinking a few times as if she had been pulled from a dream. "What is it?" "Not here. Come with me." She raised an eyebrow but followed him without question. Ethan led her to a small storage room, a cramped space lined with shelves filled with reagents and equipment no one used anymore. When he shut the door behind them, his heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. Laura crossed her arms, confused. "What's going on? You look weird." Ethan ran a hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. There was no easy way to say this. "It's about Richard. About what you feel for him." Her eyes lit up instantly, and Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. "What about him?" He swallowed hard. "Laura, what you feel for him isn't real." Her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Course it is. I've never felt this strongly about anyone." Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Every word felt like a nail being driven into his own skin. "You feel this way because of me." Silence. Laura stared at him, as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "What?" He licked his dry lips, forcing himself to continue. "I created a formula. Something that alters brain chemistry and intensifies feelings of attraction and passion. I put it in your coffee." Her eyes widened in shock. "What?" "I wanted you to feel for me what I feel for you. But something went wrong. You fell for Richard instead." Laura let out a short, incredulous laugh. "This is a joke, right?" Ethan didn't answer. He just held her gaze. Her laughter died. The silence that followed was unbearable. She took a step back, as if he were a stranger. "You're telling me you messed with my head? That you manipulated my feelings?" "Oh my God, Ethan." Her voice rose, trembling. "You drugged my coffee." "It's not a drug. Has no side effects. I just wanted you to see me differently." Laura shook her head, running her hands through her hair. "You're telling me that nothing I felt these past few weeks was real?" "It was real to you. But it wasn't natural." She let out a bitter laugh. Oh my God, this is sick. This is monstrous." Ethan felt the blow in his chest but didn't try to defend himself. Laura pushed past him, yanking the door open and rushing out, as if the air in the room had become toxic. He stood there, frozen among the shelves, feeling everything around him collapse. He had known the truth would hurt her, but he had never imagined that watching her walk away would be this unbearable. Ethan didn't see her for the rest of the day. Not in the lab, not in the cafeteria, not in any of the rooms where she usually worked. Laura had simply disappeared. And, in a way, he knew it was because she didn't want to see him. The weight of that realization crushed him. The truth was finally out, and now Laura hated him. There were no excuses that could fix what he had done. He had invaded her mind. stolen her freedom of choice. And yet, even knowing that she would probably never forgive him, he couldn't give up. If the formula had altered her feelings, then there had to be a way to reverse it. He just had to find it. In the days that followed, Ethan threw himself into his research like a man obsessed. He forgot about time, forgot about exhaustion, forgot about eating. His only goal was one thing: create an antidote. He reworked all his calculations, revisited every chemical composition, tried to understand how Laura had chosen Richard instead of him. Something in the formula must have reacted incorrectly, perhaps some unforeseen biological factor. But the more he studied, the more he reached a desperate realization. The formula didn't have a simple antidote. He couldn't just erase it from Laura's system. The love she felt for Richard wasn't just a passing illusion. It wasn't something that could simply be undone. She had already lived those emotions, had already created memories based on those feelings. Even if the substance faded and she stopped seeing Richard as the perfect man, the experiences she had would still be there. And what if, deep down, even without the formula, she still loved Richard? The thought destroyed him. But he didn't stop. He kept testing, experimenting, searching for a way to at least accelerate the degradation of the compounds in her brain. If he couldn't erase her feelings, maybe he could weaken them. And all the while, Laura acted as if he didn't exist. She no longer spoke to him. Not a glance, not a brief acknowledgement in the hallway. And when Richard was around, it was even worse. She still saw something in him that no one else did. She still justified his rudeness, his indifference. Ethan wanted to rip his own hair out every time he saw it happen. It was his fault. Until one day he noticed the first crack in the illusion. It happened during a meeting. Richard, impatient as always, cut off a scientist mid-explanation and rolled his eyes. "My God, why do you people overcomplicate everything? Bottom line, is this going to make us money or not?" The words passed unnoticed by everyone. Everyone except Laura. For the first time she hesitated. Her gaze lingered on Richard for just a moment longer, and something different crossed her face. Doubt. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But Ethan saw it, and in that instant he realized something. The formula's effect was weakening. Laura was starting to see Richard for who he truly was. Laura felt as if she were waking up from a strange dream, a feverish delirium from which she was only now escaping. The obsession she had felt for Richard had vanished, dissipating like mist under the sun. The blind enchantment, the urgency to be near him, it was all gone. What remained was a deep emptiness, and a growing anger at herself. How had she not seen it before? How had she allowed that man to treat her with such disregard, as if she were nothing more than a disposable tool in the lab? Richard had never cared. He had never really seen her. And now that the illusion was shattered, Laura could finally see what had always been there. A cold, cruel, egotistical man. She needed to get out of there. Her heart pounded as she walked through the hallways, passing by colleagues engaged in light-hearted conversations, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. Her body moved on instinct, but her mind already knew exactly where she was going. She needed to see Ethan. When she stepped into the advanced research sector, she found him hunched over his workstation, surrounded by open notebooks, test tubes, and empty vials. He hadn't noticed her yet. His trembling hands clutched a pipette, his eyes darting over frantic scribbles in his notes. His lab coat was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. Laura stood there watching him. For days she had tried to hate him, and in some ways she still did. But in that moment, something inside her cracked as she saw him like this, destroyed by his own mistake, consumed by guilt. She took a slow step forward. "Ethan." He froze instantly. The air seemed to leave his lungs before he even turned to face her. When he finally did, his face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if he couldn't accept that she was really standing there. "Laura." His voice was weak, raw from exhaustion. He let go of the pipette, his hands trembling. His breath hitched, and before she could say anything, he took a step toward her. Please forgive me. Laura said nothing. I've spent the last few days trying to fix this. He gestured at the mess surrounding him, desperation in his eyes. Trying to create an antidote, trying to find some way to erase what I did. But I can't. I can't undo it. He ran a hand over his face, looking utterly broken. I never should have done this to you. Laura crossed her arms, a tight knot forming in her throat. You hurt me, Ethan. He closed his eyes, absorbing the blow without trying to defend himself. I know. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions inside her. But I understand, she said at last. I understand why you did it. His eyes opened, filled with surprise. Laura looked away, ashamed of what she was about to admit. You just wanted me to see you. He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. But it was a mistake I would never make again. My heart is shattered just thinking about the monstrosity of what I did to you. He hesitated, then looked at her with more sincerity than she had ever seen in him. If you didn't develop feelings for me naturally, then that's how it was meant to be. But I love you too much, and I just wanted you to love me the same way. The silence that followed was dense, heavy with something Laura couldn't quite name. But as she looked at him, she realized something. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He wasn't searching for justifications or excuses. He was just telling the truth. For the first time she really saw him. You loved me that much, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Enough to do something so wrong. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words struck him deep. Love you. I always have. And I always will. Her heart clenched. She should hate him. But she didn't anymore. The hurt was still there, the pain hadn't disappeared, but something stronger had begun to surface beneath it. Something that didn't come from a formula, something that wasn't born out of a mistake. Something real. Ethan wasn't perfect, but no one had ever loved her like this. Laura took a deep breath and slowly reached for his hand. Ethan inhaled sharply, startled by the gesture. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, she admitted, her voice soft. But I know that I want to try. His eyes welled with unshed tears, a relief so deep it was as if she had pulled him from drowning. The days passed in a blur. Laura tried to focus on work, tried to go through her routine as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. Everything felt empty now. What tormented her most wasn't Richard, nor the humiliating memories of everything she had done for him. What hurt the most was the feeling that she couldn't trust herself. Everything she had felt in the past weeks, everything she had believed to be real, had been a lie. And yet, in the middle of all of it, there was one undeniable truth. Ethan. He hadn't tried to justify himself. He hadn't tried to soften what he did. He had accepted the blame. And he had spent days and nights destroying himself, trying to fix something that maybe could never be fixed. And now, for the first time, Laura wanted to see him of her own free will. She found him in the lab, exactly where she knew he would be. The space was dimly lit by the glow of monitors, and Ethan was sitting at his workstation, surrounded by scattered notes, empty vials, and the mess of someone who no longer cared about anything else. He looked exhausted. He looked lost. Laura stood at the doorway for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped inside. Are you going to punish yourself forever? Her voice cut through the silence, and Ethan's head snapped up in surprise. His eyes were sunken, bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. It took him a moment to process that she was really there. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice rough. Laura ignored the question and walked closer. I just want to know. Are you going to spend the rest of your life trying to fix a mistake that can't be undone? Ethan lowered his gaze to his hands, silent. What else should I do? He murmured. She crossed her arms, frustration rising inside her. You could live. He let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't think I deserve that. Laura felt her chest tighten. And do you think I deserved what you did to me? Ethan closed his eyes, as if the question was a physical blow. "Oh, you didn't. Then why did you do it?" He looked up at her, and the pain in his eyes caught her off guard. "'Cause I loved you. Because I thought that if you loved me back, it would make it right." Laura held her breath for a moment, absorbing his words. "And now," Ethan slowly shook his head, "now I know that love can't be stolen. It can't be fabricated. I understand my mistakes, and I take responsibility for what I did. Now, all I can do is move forward and try to let go." Something inside Laura shook. That was the difference between the Ethan who had deceived her and the Ethan standing before her now. The man who created the formula wanted her love at any cost. The man in front of her accepted the possibility of never having her again. And that was exactly what made Laura stay. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know if she would ever be able to fully forgive him, or if she could ever truly forget. But she knew she wanted to try. "You loved me that much?" she asked, her voice softer than she expected. Ethan gave her a sad smile. "I still do." Laura took a deep breath. Then slowly she reached for his hand. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath, surprised. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said, looking at her own fingers intertwined with his. "But I'm here." He looked at her, as if he couldn't believe it was real. "Why?" Laura finally lifted her eyes and smiled. "Because for the first time, this choice is mine."
If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. We need your support.
Better stories are yet to come.